The flowers on her wedding altar were already dying. Rose noticed it before she noticed anything else. The way the white petals had begun to curl inward at the edges, brown and brittle, as though the blooms themselves had decided to mourn something she had not yet been told. She had arranged them herself 3 days prior, weaving lavender and pale roses through iron rings hung with linen ribbon. She had pricked her finger on a thorn and laughed about it. She had thought it was a good sign, that even pain could feel light when the future seemed certain. She was 23 years old, and she believed she knew exactly what her life would be. The great hall of Ashvale Manor smelled of beeswax and pine resin, and the morning light came in sideways through the tall leaded windows, casting long gold rectangles across the stone floor. The guests had not yet arrived. The ceremony was set for midday. Rose stood at the far end of the hall in her linen dress. Ivory, simple, the kind her mother would have approved of, and she told herself that the hollow feeling in her chest was only nerves. She told herself that every bride felt this way. Her fingers moved to the small iron brooch at her collar, the one her father had left her before he died. It was shaped like a crescent, old and worn smooth, and she had carried it with her since she was a girl of 7, pressing her thumb against the curve of it whenever the world felt unsteady. She pressed it now. The hollow feeling did not go away. Her soon-to-be husband, Lord Cedric of the Ashvale Pack, had been chosen for her by his father, and hers before either of them could remember agreeing to it. She had known him most of her life. A tall, careful man with pale eyes and a composed smile, the kind of smile that gave away very little. She had told herself, over the years, that composure was not coldness, that quiet was not distance, that the absence of warmth was not the same as the presence of something wrong. She had been very good at telling herself things. A door opened somewhere behind the altar. Rose did not turn immediately. She thought it was Mira, her chambermaid, coming with the veil. But the footsteps were too heavy, and there were 2 sets of them, and they stopped too abruptly, the way people stop when they believe they are alone. The elder won't hold the papers beyond tonight. The voice was low, male, and not Cedric's. It belonged to his younger brother Fenwick. You need to sign before the ceremony. Once she's bound to you legally, the land transfers whether she lives or not. Rose's hand tightened around the brooch. Whether she lives or not. I know the timeline. Cedric's voice. Flat, efficient. The voice she had mistaken for steadiness all these years. The herbalist confirmed the tincture is tasteless. It works within a fortnight. There will be no signs that point to anything unnatural. And the Omega girl? Does she suspect? A pause. Rose suspects nothing, Cedric said. She never has. That's the only useful thing about her. The hall felt as though it had tilted sideways. Rose did not move. She could not move. Her boots were fixed to the stone floor as though the cold had crept up through the soles and into her bones, locking her in place. The brooch cut into her palm. She did not feel it. Omega. They called her that the way someone calls a tool by its category, not her name, not her person. A classification, a container for something they intended to empty and discard. She had known, in the dim way one knows things they refuse to look at directly, that she was considered low-ranking in the world of the packs. She had no wolf. She had never shifted. She had grown up in the borderlands of this world, half inside it and half out, claimed by a pack through her father's bloodline, but never truly belonging. She had spent her whole life being quietly, politely overlooked. She had thought Cedric saw past that. She understood now that he had only seen further use for it. Her mind began to work before her body caught up. She catalogued what she knew with the eerie calm of someone in shock. The land was hers by her father's will, a stretch of northern territory near the Greywood border that she had never thought much about. The ceremony was at midday. The papers were with the elder. The tincture. She pressed her lips together. The tincture was tasteless. She thought of the tea Cedric had brought her each morning for the past week. Herbal, he'd said. For your nerves before the wedding. Her stomach turned over. She moved before she decided to move. Rose stepped backward, slowly, 1 foot at a time, until the stone pillar behind her pressed cold against her shoulder blades. She kept her breathing shallow. She kept her steps silent. The voices continued behind the altar. Fenwick asking something about the pack elder's loyalty, Cedric answering in that same efficient tone. And she used the sound of them to cover the soft drag of her boots against the floor. She reached the side corridor. She ran. Not the way a person runs in panic. Not blindly. Not with noise. She ran the way someone runs when they understand that making a sound will cost them everything. She pulled her skirts up with both hands and moved through the servants' passage that ran alongside the manor's eastern wall, the one she had memorized years ago as a child playing in a house that was never quite hers. The passage smelled of old wool and tallow, and the ceiling was low, and she had to duck beneath a rusted hook where cloaks were sometimes hung. She grabbed one as she passed. Dark wool, heavy, someone's riding cloak left on the hook since autumn. She wrapped it around her shoulders without stopping. The passage led out near the stables. The stable hand, a boy of perhaps 16, looked up from his work with wide eyes when she came through the door. She pressed a finger to her lips. She did not know if he would hold his silence. She did not wait to find out. She went to the nearest stall, to the brown mare she had ridden a dozen times before, and she had the animal saddled in 3 minutes, with hands that only shook slightly. She did not take the main road. She took the eastern path, the narrow one that wound into the gray wood along the ridge, the one that traders used when they wanted to avoid the pack's border checkpoints. She knew it ended somewhere near the river crossing, and after the river crossing, she did not know what came next. She told herself that not knowing was acceptable. She told herself she would figure it out. The morning air hit her like cold water when she cleared the manor gates, sharp, smelling of pine and frost and damp earth, and she leaned over the mare's neck and urged her faster. Behind her, Ashvale Manor grew small and then disappeared behind the tree line. The white flowers on the altar were still dying. The tea she had drunk that morning sat in her stomach like a stone. She rode until the trees thickened and the light turned green, and the sound of the manor bell, ringing noon, ringing the start of a ceremony for a bride who was already gone, faded into the distance. Then she stopped. She pressed her forehead against the mare's warm neck and allowed herself exactly 1 moment of falling apart. Just one. She felt the shaking move through her from her hands to her shoulders, felt the tight burning pressure behind her eyes, felt the truth of the morning settle into her body like something permanent. They had planned to kill her. The man she had agreed to build a life with had looked at her across dinner tables and council rooms and quiet evenings and had already decided how long she had to live. She lifted her head. The forest was very still. Somewhere above, a bird moved through the branches. The mare exhaled, a long, warm breath that fogged in the cold air. Rose straightened her spine. She pressed her thumb once more against the crescent brooch. Her father's brooch, the only thing that had ever truly belonged to her. And she looked at the path ahead, narrow, root-crossed, disappearing into shadow. She nudged the mare forward. She had no plan yet. She had no allies. She had no wolf, no pack, no name that carried weight in this world. She did not even know what she was. That question had followed her since childhood like a stone in her shoe, always present, never answered. What are you, Rose? Not quite human. Not quite wolf. Something that didn't have a category. She had always found that question frightening. She did not know yet that the most dangerous man in the known territories would ask her that same question within 48 hours, and that her inability to answer it would change everything. The river crossing was worse than she remembered. The water was high from recent rains, brown and fast-moving, churning against the flat stones that were supposed to serve as a path across. Rose sat on the mare at the bank's edge and looked at the crossing for a long moment, calculating. The stones were slick. The current pulled hard to the left. The far bank was close enough to see, dark soil, exposed roots, a fallen log half submerged. But close and safe were not the same thing. She went anyway. The mare hesitated twice, and both times Rose kept her voice low and steady, murmuring against the animal's flattened ears, coaxing rather than commanding. The water came up past the mare's knees at the deepest point and soaked through Rose's boots entirely, and the cold of it was immediate and vicious, climbing up through her legs and settling in her lower back like a fist. She kept her eyes on the far bank. She did not look at the current. They made it across. Rose dismounted on the far side and stood for a moment with her hands on her knees, breathing. Her skirts were soaked from the knee down, heavy and clinging, and the riding cloak she'd taken from the stable hook was already beginning to smell of wet wool. She wrung out what she could from the hem, which was very little, and she remounted and continued north along the tree line because north was away, and away was the only direction that made sense. By the time the light began to change, the gold of midday going gray, the shadows between the pines lengthening, she was deep enough into the gray wood that the trees blocked most of the sky. She could hear the manor bell no longer. She could hear nothing except the mare's breathing, the occasional drip of water from branches overhead, and the soft percussion of hooves on pine needles. She was also starting to feel unwell. It had begun as a dull ache behind her eyes, the kind that comes with cold and fear and no food since the previous evening. But by the time she registered it clearly, it had moved into her joints, her wrists, her knees, the deep hinge of her hips, and the cold of her wet clothing was no longer merely uncomfortable. It was making her slow. Her thoughts had begun to feel muffled, as though arriving from a slight distance, and once she noticed that, she noticed also that her grip on the reins had loosened without her deciding to loosen it. The tea. She didn't know how much she had consumed before she'd stopped. She didn't know what the herbalist had used, or how quickly it moved through a body. She only knew that the aching in her joints felt different from ordinary cold, and that the fogginess in her mind was moving inward rather than lifting. She needed to stop. She needed warmth. She had neither. The mare made the decision for her, in the end. The animal slowed, then stopped entirely, turning her head toward a break in the trees to the left, some animal instinct drawing her attention to something Rose could not yet see. Rose let her go. The mare picked a careful path through a stand of young birch trees, white-barked and close together, and emerged into a small clearing where a structure stood, a hunting cabin, old, the logs darkened with age and weather, the roof thick with moss. A woodpile sat against the eastern wall under a rough shelter of pine boards. The door was closed, but not barred. Rose slid from the saddle and nearly went down when her legs met the ground. She caught herself against the mare's flank, stood still for a moment, breathed. Then she unsaddled the mare with clumsy, aching fingers and tied her to the woodpile shelter with enough line to graze the clearing's edge, and she pushed open the cabin door and went inside. The interior was one room, a stone hearth, a narrow bed frame with a straw mattress, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with a rusted tin, a stack of tallow candles, a folded blanket that smelled of cedar and old smoke. There was wood stacked beside the hearth, dry and ready. Someone used this place seasonally. A hunter, a trapper, someone who kept it provisioned out of habit. Rose built a fire with hands she could barely feel. It took 4 attempts to get the flint to catch, and by the time the kindling took and the first real flame appeared, she was sitting on the hearthstone with her forehead nearly touching the iron grate, close enough that the heat arrived like a relief so sharp it was almost painful. She peeled off her boots, spread her wet skirts as close to the fire as she dared, pulled the cedar blanket around her shoulders. She did not sleep. She was afraid to sleep. Instead, she sat and thought, the way she had always thought best, methodically, working from what she knew toward what she needed. The land her father had left her. The northern territory near the Greywood border. She had never been there, had only seen it described in the documents the pack elder had read aloud at her father's estate settlement when she was 19. a stretch of high ground, forested, with a river along the eastern edge. Pack neutral, her father had specified in his will, to belong to Rose alone, under no Alpha's authority. She had thought it was a sentimental gesture. She understood now it had been a protection. Her father had known something. The thought arrived quietly, but it settled with weight. Her father, Aldrich, had been a careful man, not clever in the way of scholars, but careful in the way of someone who had learned to watch the world and read what it was actually doing rather than what it claimed to be doing. He had kept records. She remembered the study in his old house, the shelves dense with ledgers and correspondence, the stacks of rolled parchment that he had never let her touch. She had assumed they were pack business, trade agreements, the dull machinery of territory management. She wondered now what they actually contained. She was still wondering when the sound came, not from outside the door, from the trees to the north of the clearing. A heavy, deliberate sound. The movement of something very large through underbrush, not attempting concealment. Branches snapping in a clean rhythm. Then silence. Then the sound of something circling the cabin's perimeter, moving along the outside wall to her left. Then the back wall. Then the right side. Methodical and slow. Rose did not move. She looked at the door. The latch was a simple iron bar, already dropped into its bracket when she'd entered. It would hold against a person. Against a large wolf, she was considerably less certain. The circling stopped at the front. Silence. Then a knock. 3 deliberate strikes against the wooden door, unhurried and clear. Rose stared at the door for a long moment. Her heart was loud in her ears. Her joints still ached, and her thoughts were still slightly muffled, and she was sitting barefoot on a hearthstone in a borrowed cloak with no weapon, and no wolf, and no plan, and something enormous had just knocked on the door of the cabin she was hiding in, as though it had every right to do so. She picked up the iron fire poker from beside the hearth. "The cabin is occupied," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. A pause. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice, low, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of someone who was accustomed to being the largest presence in any space. "I know. I can smell the smoke from half a mile." She said nothing. "I'm not from Ashvale," the voice continued, as though that answered a question she hadn't asked aloud, though perhaps she hadn't needed to. "You're on Drenath territory. This cabin belongs to my pack's hunting range." Drenath. The name landed in her chest like a dropped stone. She knew that name. Every pack within 4 territories knew that name. Drenath was the northernmost and largest holding in the region, and its alpha was not a lord or a pack elder or a regional commander. Drenath's alpha was the king, the one they referred to in political councils and fearful conversations simply as the king of the northern packs, the man who had unified 7 fractured territories under one authority through a combination of strategy, force, and something that people who had met him described, always in slightly odd tones, as presence. His name was Kale. Rose looked at the fire poker in her hand. She looked at the door. She crossed the room, lifted the iron bar, and opened the door. He was larger than she had prepared herself for, broad across the shoulders, dressed in dark leather and a fur-collared traveling cloak, with long dark hair pulled back in braids and pale eyes that caught the firelight from inside the cabin and held it with unsettling steadiness. There was a thin scar along his left jaw. He stood in the doorway without leaning on it, without filling it aggressively, simply occupying it the way a stone occupies the center of a river, without effort, without apology. He looked at her, not at her disheveled state, not at her wet skirts or her bare feet or the fire poker she still held in her right hand. He looked at her face, and his expression moved through something she couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe, or something adjacent to it, before settling into a careful, composed stillness. "You came from Ashvale," he said, not a question. "I left Ashvale," she corrected. Something shifted in his expression. Almost, the edge of something that wasn't quite a smile. He looked at her for another long moment, that steady, unreadable study. And then he said, quietly, and with what seemed like genuine puzzlement rather than cruelty, "What are you?" Rose looked back at him. The fire crackled behind her. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the dark clearing, the mare shifted her weight and was quiet. Rose had been asked that question her entire life. She had deflected it and avoided it and lived around it the way one lives around a damaged floorboard, knowing it is there, stepping carefully, never pressing too hard. She had no answer now any more than she ever had. "I don't know," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in years. He did not laugh at her answer. That was the first thing she noted, that he received her confession of not knowing what she was, with the same composed attention he might give a map or a report from one of his commanders. No mockery, no visible surprise. He simply held the information, turned it over somewhere behind those pale eyes, and then stepped back from the doorway. "You need a healer," he said. It was not a question either. She had begun to understand that very few things Cale said were questions. He observed, he concluded, he stated. The interrogative was reserved for things he genuinely could not determine on his own. "I'm fine," Rose said, which was not entirely true, and which she suspected he already knew. "You're gray," he said, "and you've been holding that fire poker for 3 minutes without lowering it. Your grip is inconsistent. Something is moving through your system that shouldn't be." She looked down at her hand. He was right about the grip. Her fingers were trembling faintly against the iron, and she had not noticed because the trembling had become constant enough to feel like stillness. She lowered the poker. "There may have been something in the tea I was given this morning," she said, and the words tasted strange in her mouth. The first time she had said it aloud to anyone. The first time the reality of it had been spoken into open air rather than held inside her chest where it had been burning since the manor hall. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did. A very slight shift, the kind that spoke of a decision being made. "My camp is a 1/4 mile north," he said. "You'll ride. I'll walk beside you. I don't need—" "You nearly fell when you dismounted," he said. "I watched from the tree line." Rose closed her mouth. The admission that he had been watching, not intrusively, not predatorily, but with the focused attention of someone assessing a situation before entering it, should have unsettled her more than it did. Perhaps she was too tired for proper alarm. Perhaps the aching in her joints had begun to dull her edges. She put her boots back on. It took longer than it should have. She did not ask him to help her, and he did not offer. He waited by the door while she laced them, patient and still in the way that very large, very certain things are still. Not suppressing movement, simply not requiring it. When she stood, she took the riding cloak and the brooch and left everything else. Outside, the cold hit her immediately. The fire she'd built had warmed the cabin to something bearable, but the night air of the Greywood carried a different kind of cold. The deep, resinous cold of old forest, smelling of pine sap and frozen earth and something faintly mineral, like stone after rain. The mare was where she'd left her, and when Rose untied her, the animal leaned briefly against her shoulder in the uncomplicated way horses offer comfort. Cale walked, true to his word, and she would come to understand that his word was always true in the specific technical sense that he said exactly what he intended. He walked beside the mare at a pace that was unhurried and steady, one hand loose at his side, the other resting occasionally on the hilt of the long blade at his hip, not in threat, in habit. She watched him from the mare's back and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the forest moved around them in its nighttime vocabulary of wind and branch, and the distant sound of water. The camp was larger than she expected. She had imagined. She didn't know exactly what she had imagined. A fire, perhaps, a few tents, a handful of guards. What she found instead was a structured encampment of perhaps 30 people. Canvas pavilions arranged in a deliberate pattern, a central fire large enough to give real heat, horses picketed in a line along the western edge, sentries at the perimeter who acknowledged Cale's return with a slight nod and looked at Rose with carefully neutral expressions. A cook fire, the smell of roasted meat and something herbed. A woman met them at the camp's edge, sharp-featured, dark-haired, wearing a healer's satchel across one shoulder, and the expression of someone who had been woken from sleep and had decided to be professional about it. "This is Sarah," Cale said. "She'll determine what was used." Sarah looked at Rose with the brisk, unsentimental assessment of someone accustomed to bodies in various states of damage. "Sit down before you fall down," she said, which Rose appreciated for its honesty. She sat. Sarah worked efficiently, checking Rose's pulse at the wrist and throat, pressing carefully along her jaw and the sides of her neck, asking questions in a clipped, practical tone. What did the tea smell like? How much had she consumed? When did the joint aching begin? Rose answered everything with the same methodical precision she'd used on herself, by the fire. Stripping emotion out, reporting only fact. It was easier that way. "Grayleaf root," Sarah said, finally sitting back. "Slow-moving, accumulative. Whoever dosed you was patient. This was meant to build over days rather than act at once." She looked at Rose with something that was not quite sympathy, but was adjacent to it. "If you'd stayed through the ceremony and the first week after, you wouldn't have understood what was happening to you until it was too late to act." The words dropped into silence. Rose absorbed them. She had known this intellectually since the Manor Hall, since hearing Cedric's voice describe it to his brother in flat, efficient terms, but knowing and hearing it confirmed by a healer who had read the evidence in her own body were different things. The second was physical, in a way the first was not. It settled into her bones along with the gray leaf, and it hurt. "Can you address it?" Cale asked. He had remained nearby, not hovering, not looming, standing at a distance that was close enough to be present and far enough to allow space. She noticed that about him repeatedly, the precision with which he calibrated proximity. "Yes," Sarah said. "It'll take tonight and most of tomorrow. She'll need warmth, water, and rest, and she needs to keep eating to push it through." She looked at Rose again. "You're stronger than you look. Whatever your constitution is, it slowed the absorption considerably." Whatever your constitution is. Even the healer said it that way. The small hesitation, the unspecific phrasing, the same instinctive uncertainty that people had always expressed around Rose, without knowing what they were expressing. A tent was prepared for her. It was not elaborate, a sleeping roll, blankets, a low brazier of coals, but it was clean and warm, and no one had put anything into her food that was meant to kill her, which by that evening's standards felt like extraordinary luxury. Sarah brought her broth and a bitter tincture that she said would accelerate the Grayleaf's clearing, and Rose drank both without complaint. She slept, despite herself. The exhaustion was simply too complete. She dreamed in fragments, not memories, not quite visions, but something in between. Dark water. A crescent moon, very close, close enough to touch. Her father's study, the shelves of ledgers, and one book that seemed to hum at a frequency she could feel in her sternum. Her own hands, opening it. Pages that weren't written in any language she knew, and yet she understood them completely. She woke before dawn, breathing hard, the dream dissolving before she could hold any piece of it still enough to examine. The camp was quiet. The brazier had burned low. Through the gap in the tent's entrance flap, she could see the sky beginning to lighten at the eastern edge. That first gray-purple shift that comes before any warmth arrives, the sky deciding to become day before the sun has agreed to it. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and sat with her knees drawn up and thought about her father's study. He had kept records of everything. He had been particular about it. Meticulous in the way of someone who understood that documentation was its own form of armor. After his death, the study had been sealed pending the estate's legal settlement, she had been permitted to take only personal items: the brooch, a portrait, 3 books from the general shelf. Everything else had passed into the pack elder's custody for review. She had never thought to question that. At 19, grieving and unsteady, she had accepted the procedure as ordinary. She was no longer 19. She was also no longer the version of herself who accepted the shape of things without asking who had drawn the outline. The tent flap moved. Kyle stood at the entrance, not entering, observing the boundary, and looked at her with that same careful attention he'd used since the cabin. In the pre-dawn light, his face was less readable than before, all shadow and strong angles, but his eyes carried that pale, focused quality that seemed to work independently of light conditions. "You're awake early," he said. "So are you. I don't sleep much." He said it without complaint or pride, simply a fact. "How do you feel?" She took an honest inventory. The joint aching had diminished considerably, still present, but no longer the consuming thing it had been. Her thoughts were clearer. Her grip, when she flexed her fingers, was steady. "Better," she said. "Enough to think." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you thinking about?" "My father's study," she said, "and whether the pack elder who sealed it after his death had any reason to make sure certain records never came to light." The silence that followed was the particular kind that forms when someone receives unexpected information and weighs it with genuine seriousness rather than dismissing it. "Tell me about your father," Cale said. He did not come inside the tent. He sat at the entrance, his back against the tent post, the sky lightening behind him, and he listened. And she talked, and the words came out in the careful, organized way that things come out when they have been stored for a long time in a person who needed to be quiet about them. She talked about Aldrich, about the study, about the land he'd left her, about the will and the estate settlement, and the pack elder named Oswin who had managed all of it with smooth, practiced efficiency and a sympathy that now, recalled in this new light, seemed considerably more performed than genuine. When she finished, Cale was quiet for a moment. "Oswin of the Asheville Council," he said, "has been under Drenath observation for 14 months. Rose stared at him. "For what reason?" she asked, though some part of her had already begun assembling the answer. "Land irregularities," Kyle said. "Territory that appears neutral on record but has changed hands in ways the documentation doesn't support." He looked at her steadily. "Your father's northern holding appeared in those records 8 months ago. We couldn't determine the legal owner." The crescent brooch was warm in Rose's palm. "It's mine," she said. "I know that now," Cale said. The sky outside had gone from gray-purple to the first pale gold of actual morning, and the camp was beginning to wake around them. The soft sounds of people rising, the rekindling of the central fire, the low voices of guards exchanging the watch. Rose looked at the man sitting at the entrance of her tent, who had walked beside her horse in the dark and had not once asked her to be grateful for it, who had listened to everything she said and had confirmed that the shape of things was even darker than she had understood, and who had still, through all of it, not told her what to do next. He was waiting, she realized. He was waiting to see what she would decide. She decided before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. "I want to see those records," Rose said. "The ones from your observation of Oswin. Everything Drenath has collected." Cale nodded once, as though this was precisely what he had expected her to say. He rose from the tent entrance and said, simply, "Come when you're ready," and walked away without adding conditions or qualifiers, or the particular brand of gentle discouragement that men so often wrapped around requests from women they considered fragile. She was ready in 10 minutes. Sarah intercepted her at the camp's central fire with a cup of something hot and a piece of bread, and Rose ate while walking because there was no time to sit, and the healer seemed to understand this, falling into step beside her briefly to check her pulse once more before peeling away with a satisfied nod. Kyle's command tent was larger than the others, but not lavish. A working space. Maps spread across a wide table, weighted at the corners with smooth river stones, correspondence stacked in ordered piles, 2 oil lamps burning with clean, steady flames. The smell of the space was cedar and ink and leather, and underneath those, something that Rose's senses registered without her permission. The particular warmth of a space that belonged to someone specific, the way a room absorbs the presence of its occupant and holds it. She looked at the maps. A man stood at the table's far end, silver-haired, compact, wearing the practical dark clothing of someone whose role was information rather than combat. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes moved briefly to Cale with a question in them. "This is Rowan," Cale said. "He leads Drenath's intelligence work. Show her the Oswin file." Rowan looked at Rose for a moment, with the assessing gaze of someone deciding how much trust to extend and on what basis. Then he reached into a leather document case and withdrew a folded bundle of papers, setting them on the table in front of her. She read. The documents were meticulous. Rowan's work clearly, precise and organized. The kind of record-keeping that matched her father's in its understanding that documentation was armor. What they contained was worse than she had imagined, and simultaneously, exactly what some cold, clear part of her had suspected since she sat by the cabin fire and thought about her father's study. Oswin had been falsifying Pack territory records for at least 6 years. Land that appeared neutral on the official rolls had been quietly reclassified, boundary markers adjusted in documents while the physical land remained unchanged, legal ownership transferred through a chain of Pack Council signatures that created the appearance of legitimate process, while concealing that the original owners had never agreed to any of it. In several cases, those original owners had died under circumstances recorded as illness or accident. Her father's name appeared in the documents 4 times. Rose set the papers down. She pressed her palms flat against the table and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she had in the manor hall when she first heard Cedric's voice and felt the floor go out from under her. She had learned in the past 24 hours that she could absorb terrible information if she gave her body something physical to anchor to. Flat palms on a table, cold stone under her feet, the rough texture of a brooch against her thumb. "My father didn't die of fever," she said. The room was quiet. "We don't have proof of that specifically," Rowan said carefully. "But the pattern is consistent with the others. Then we find proof," Rose said. She lifted her eyes from the table and looked at Cale. "What does Drenath want from this? You've been observing Oswin for 14 months. You haven't moved against him. Why?" It was a direct question, the kind that demanded a direct answer, and she was aware that asking it this bluntly, asking the Alpha King of the Northern Packs to account for his own strategic decisions, might be received as impudence. She asked it anyway. She was done performing smallness for people who did not deserve even her courtesy. Cale met her gaze without any visible irritation. "Jurisdiction," he said. "Ashvale territory is not under Drenath authority. Moving against Oswin without cause formally recognized by the Interpack Council would have given Ashvale grounds to resist and potentially drawn other packs into a territorial dispute. I needed a complainant with direct legal standing." "Someone whose land was taken," Rose said. "Someone whose land was taken," he confirmed. The understanding settled between them with a particular clarity. She was not simply a refugee he had found in a hunting cabin. She was, in legal terms, precisely what he had needed. The documented heir to land that had been fraudulently targeted, a direct complainant with standing before the Interpack Council. And now, given that her life had been actively threatened by parties connected to Oswin's network, grounds for formal intervention that no other pack could legitimately contest. She should have felt used. She waited for the feeling and examined it carefully when it arrived, and found that it was not quite what she expected, because he had not manufactured her situation. He had not arranged for Cedric to plan her death, or for Oswin to falsify the land records. He had simply been watching a corruption that already existed, waiting for the legal key. and she had arrived in his forest with that key around her neck and the evidence of an attempt on her life in her bloodstream. He had also built her a fire and walked beside her horse in the dark and told her what he knew without asking what he would receive in return. "What do you propose?" she asked. Cale moved to the map table and indicated a point near the northeastern edge, a building marked with the symbol for a council hall. "There is an inner pack assembly scheduled in 12 days at Veldrath Hold. All senior pack representatives will be present, including Oswin. If you appear before that council with formal documentation of the land fraud and a healer's attestation of the poisoning attempt, the council is legally obligated to investigate. Oswin cannot dismiss it. Cedric cannot suppress it. And because you are on Dranath territory under my protection, neither of them can reach you before you arrive." 12 days, Rose said. 12 days. She looked at the map. She looked at the documents spread across the table. 14 months of careful, patient observation, waiting for the right moment and the right person. "There's something else," she said. Rowan glanced up. "My father's study was sealed after his death and placed in Pack Elder custody. Oswin's custody." She kept her voice even. "If there are records in that study that document what he knew, what he had discovered about the land manipulation, those records are currently in the possession of the man responsible for his death." "Yes," Cale said. "Can they be retrieved?" The pause that followed was brief, but specific. "That would require entering Ashvale territory without invitation," Rowan said, "which, under current inter-pack law—" "Rowan," Cale said quietly. Rowan stopped. Cale looked at the map for a moment, then at Rose. "Give me 2 days to arrange it," he said. She understood then the full weight of what he was offering. Not comfort, not reassurance, but action. The specific, costly, legally complicated action of a king choosing to move on behalf of someone with no army, no pack, and no wolf, because the cause was just, and the evidence was clear, and some part of his own code of authority apparently required that power be used for something other than its own preservation. She did not thank him effusively. She suspected he would find that uncomfortable. "Then I need to know what was in those records before I stand before the council," she said. "Whatever my father knew, I need to know it first." Kyle looked at her steadily. "Agreed." The days that followed had a particular texture, purposeful and contained, the feeling of a spring being compressed before release. Rose spent them in the command tent with Rowan, working through the documentation, building the legal framework of her complaint with the methodical precision that she had always been better at than anyone in her life had paused to notice. She had her father's attention to record, and her mother's composure under pressure, and something else beneath both of those. Something that had no name yet. A quality of perception that allowed her to see the shape of a problem from multiple angles simultaneously, to hold several threads of logic at once without losing any of them. Rowan noticed it on the second day. "Where were you educated?" he asked, not unkindly, looking up from a document she had just annotated with 3 precise observations that had taken him considerably longer to reach independently. "Mostly alone," she said. "My father's library." Rowan looked at her for a moment in the assessing way he had, and then went back to his work. But she caught the slight adjustment in how he addressed her afterward. A fractional increase in directness. The small recalibration of someone revising an estimate upward. On the third night, the team Cale had sent into Ashvale returned. They came in after dark, 4 of them, quiet and efficient, and they brought with them a locked document case that smelled of old paper and cedar oil. Her father's smell, so specifically and unexpectedly, his that Rose had to stand still for a moment in the middle of the camp, with her hand pressed over her mouth. She opened the case at the map table, under the oil lamps, with Kyle standing nearby. The contents were extensive, years of correspondence, ledgers, and at the bottom of the case, a sealed letter addressed in her father's handwriting to a name she did not recognize, with a secondary notation beneath. "If I cannot deliver this myself, it must reach her. Rose will know what to do with it." Her hands were very steady when she broke the seal. The letter was long, She read it twice, standing, and then she sat down because her legs had quietly decided they were finished with the upright position. Her father had known about Oswin for 3 years before his death. He had documented the land fraud carefully, had identified at least 4 other families whose territory had been taken through the same method. He had also discovered something else. Something that explained, at last, the question that had followed Rose her entire life like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Her mother had not been a pack wolf. Her mother had been something older, a bloodline so rare that most packs had stopped believing it existed. A line connected, her father wrote carefully, to the founding covenant of the old territories, before the pack system had formalized, when the bond between wolf-kind and the land itself had been something different from what it had become. Her mother's people had been called groundkeepers in the oldest records. Not shifters, not humans, but something that existed at the intersection of both, bound to the land in a way that was literal rather than political. The northern territory her father had left her was not incidental. It was the ancestral seat of her mother's bloodline. It had been in that family for 300 years before the pack system had drawn its lines around it and called it neutral territory, and gradually, generation by generation, forgotten what it actually was. Oswin had not forgotten. Oswin had known exactly what he was trying to take. Rose set the letter down. She looked up at Cale, who had been reading quietly beside her, and found him already watching her with that steady, careful attention. Not pity, not calculation, but the focused regard of someone who has just received important information and is waiting to understand what it means to the person it belongs to. "You asked me what I am," she said. "I did," he said. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm the last of something." The oil lamps burned steadily. Outside, the camp was quiet. The forest pressed close and dark around them, and somewhere in it, the land that had waited 300 years to be claimed by the right hands was waiting still. The road to Veldrath Hold took 4 days. They traveled as a formal delegation, Cale at the front with his senior guards, Rowan beside him with the document cases, and Rose in the middle of the column on the brown mare, wearing a dark wool riding cloak that one of Cale's people had produced from somewhere, properly fitted and warm, nothing like the borrowed thing she had grabbed from the stable hook 9 days prior. The difference between those 2 cloaks felt symbolic in a way she didn't examine too closely. She spent the journey reading every document her father had compiled, every letter, every careful annotation in his precise, slightly slanted handwriting. She read them in the mornings when they stopped to rest the horses, and in the evenings by firelight when the camp was quiet, and she built from them a picture of a man she had loved but not fully known. A man who had spent the last years of his life quietly, methodically, at great personal risk, trying to construct a protection for a daughter he understood was in more danger than she knew. He had not told her. She had thought, initially, that this was a failure, that he should have warned her, prepared her, handed her the case and explained everything while he was still alive to explain it. But she understood by the 3rd day of reading why he hadn't. Because the danger was real, and Oswin's reach was long, and the safest version of Rose was one who genuinely did not know, who moved through her life with authentic ignorance, who could not be pressured into revealing information she had never been given. He had hidden everything in the study, and sealed the study, and written a letter addressed to a name she still didn't fully recognize, trusting that if something happened to him, the right chain of events would eventually find its way to her hands. He had trusted the land, she thought. He had trusted that the territory would call to her eventually. She pressed her thumb against the crescent brooch and looked at the road ahead. Veldrath Hold was a stone structure of considerable age, built at the intersection of 3 pack territories precisely because it belonged to none of them. A neutral ground by ancient agreement, maintained collectively, used for inter-pack councils and formal dispute proceedings. It rose from the surrounding forest, like something that had grown rather than been built, the stone dark with weather and centuries. The iron gates open in the formal welcome required by protocol when a sitting alpha arrived. They were expected. What was not expected, or rather, what Oswin had not expected, was Rose. She saw him in the entrance courtyard, among the cluster of pack representatives and their retinues gathering for the assembly. He was a tall man, silver-haired and well-dressed, with the smooth, composed face of someone who had spent decades being the most informed person in every room he entered. He was speaking with Cedric when Rose rode into the courtyard, and she watched the exact moment he saw her, the fractional pause, the microscopic tightening around his eyes, the performance of recovery that followed so quickly that anyone not specifically watching for it would have missed it entirely. Cedric went pale. Rose looked at him across the courtyard, at the man who had brought her tea every morning and calculated the precise number of days until she would be gone, and she felt something clarify inside her. Not rage, though the rage was there underneath. Something colder and more useful than rage. Clarity. The absolute, grounded certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and why. She dismounted without looking at him again. The formal proceedings of an Interpack Council assembly followed their own ancient protocol, and Rowan had prepared Rose for every step of it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that procedure was its own form of weapon. She entered the council hall beside Cale, not behind him, beside him, which was itself a statement that the assembled representatives registered and quietly absorbed. And she sat at the complainant's position at the long stone table, and she placed her father's document case in front of her. The council elder, a woman named Hadra, whose age was impossible to determine, and whose authority in this space was absolute, called the assembly to order. Oswin attempted, twice, to raise procedural objections before the formal complaint was even presented. Hadra dismissed both with the particular efficiency of someone who has heard every procedural objection that exists and is no longer impressed by any of them. Rose stood. She spoke for 40 minutes. She had not prepared a speech in the traditional sense. She had prepared evidence, organized into a sequence that built from established fact to documented fraud to proven conspiracy, each piece supported by the records in her father's case and Rowan's 14 months of observation, and Sarah's signed healer's attestation regarding the grayleaf poisoning. She spoke in the same tone she used when working through documents at the map table, clear, precise, without performance, letting the facts carry the weight they had earned. She watched the faces of the council members as she spoke. She watched understanding arrive in some and discomfort in others, the specific discomfort of people who had not been directly involved, but had perhaps not looked too carefully at things that might have warranted looking. When she finished, the hall was very quiet. Oswin attempted a rebuttal. It lasted 6 minutes before Hadra stopped him and asked, with a precision that was almost surgical, a question about a specific document date that contradicted his own testimony. He could not answer it. The silence that followed his failure to answer was the loudest thing Rose had heard since Cedric's voice in the manor hall, and it was immeasurably more satisfying. The council's deliberation took 2 hours. Rose sat in an anteroom with Cale and Rowan, and a cup of something warm that she held without drinking. And she looked at the stone floor and allowed herself to feel the full weight of the past 12 days. The wedding hall and the dying flowers, the river crossing, the cabin, the fever-edged night, her father's letter, 4 days of roads and reading and arriving. Finally, at a room where the truth had been spoken aloud in front of witnesses who were required by law to respond to it. "You did well," Kyle said. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the far wall, his forearms resting on his knees. And the observation had been made the way he made most observations. Simply, without ornamentation, as though it would have been inaccurate to say nothing. "My father did the work," she said. "Your father built the case," Cale said. "You understood it well enough to present it in a way that no one in that room could dismiss." He paused. "Those are different skills." She looked back at the floor. "I still don't know what a groundkeeper is," she said. "Not fully. I've read the word in his documents, but the records he had access to were incomplete." "There are older archives in Drenath," Kyle said, "records from before the pack consolidation. If the bloodline is what your father believed, the documentation will be there." She absorbed this. The offer was practical, and he had made it practically, without weight or implication. Access to records, nothing more. And yet, "Why have you helped me?" she asked, not defensively, genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, he chose his words with the same deliberateness he applied to everything. "Because the law was being violated and you had standing to address it," he said. "Because your father was killed for knowing the truth, and that demands a response. And because—" He paused again, briefly. "Whatever you are, Rose, you walked into that council hall today with nothing but documented evidence and your own composure. And you moved a room full of alpha representatives to silence. That is not nothing. That deserves to be defended." She didn't respond immediately. She held the words and examined them the way she examined everything now, carefully, for what they actually contained, rather than what she might want them to mean. He had not promised her anything she had not earned. He had not softened the world for her, or attempted to manage her grief, or position himself between her and the truth of what she had lost. He had walked beside her horse, and listened to her speak, and given her access to every resource he had, and then stepped back and let her use them. That was its own kind of rare. The council returned. Hadra delivered the findings in the formal language of Interpack law, which was dense and ancient, and which Rowan translated quietly into plain terms as it was read. Oswin was found in violation of territorial law on 6 counts. His position as pack elder was immediately suspended pending criminal investigation by the Neutral Council Authority. All land transfers executed under his administration for the past 6 years were frozen and subject to review. Cedric of Ashvale, as a co-conspirator in a documented poisoning attempt, was remanded to council custody. Rose's claim to the Northern Territory was formally confirmed. Hadra looked at Rose across the council table and said, in a tone that was not entirely without warmth, "The land is yours as it should have been. What you do with it is your own matter." Rose stood. "I'd like to begin with my father's full record," she said, "and a proper accounting of what was taken from the other families." Hadra nodded once. "That can be arranged." What followed was not a single dramatic moment, but a series of necessary ones, the way justice usually works when it works properly. Not in a single blow, but in accumulated reckoning. The council's investigators moved into Ashvale within the week. Oswin's records, when fully examined, implicated 2 additional council members in the surrounding territories, both of whom were removed from their positions before the month was out. The families whose land had been taken were identified, their claims reviewed, their territories restored, where restoration was possible. Cedric stood before the council 3 weeks later and offered no defense that held, because there was none to offer. Rose was not present for his formal sentencing. She had already left Veldrath Hold by then, traveling north with a small Drenath escort toward the territory that had waited 300 years for her to claim it. The land, when she reached it, was exactly what her father's documents had described. High ground, heavily forested, a river along the eastern edge that ran clear and cold over dark stones. She stood at the boundary marker on the first morning and put her bare hand against an old oak tree at the tree line and felt something she had no language for yet. A recognition, moving upward from the earth through the tree and into her palm, the particular warmth of something that had been waiting. She was the last of a line that had nearly been erased. She was also, she understood now, the beginning of whatever came next. Cale arrived 3 days after she did, which she had not expected, and which she did not show surprise about, because she was getting better at receiving the unexpected with equanimity. He came with a small retinue and a letter from Rowan that contained, among other things, a reference to the Drenath archives, and a list of texts that contained historical documentation of the groundkeeper bloodline. He stayed for a week. They talked, mostly, at the river in the mornings, in the evenings by the fire in the old stone structure she had begun to clear and repair with the help of his people, and 2 local families who had appeared on the 3rd day, apparently having heard that someone had finally come to the Northern Territory and intended to stay. He told her about Drenath, about the particular difficulties of holding 7 territories in genuine, rather than merely formal unity. She told him about her father's library, about the education she had assembled alone from books that had no curriculum, about the years of being in a world that didn't have a category for her, and learning to treat that as information rather than insult. On the last evening before he left, they sat on the ridge above the river as the sun went down, and he said without preamble, "You're going to need alliances. The council case has made you visible in ways that bring protection and vulnerability simultaneously." "I know," she said. "Drenath is prepared to offer formal alliance, not as a subordinate relationship, as a mutual one. The territory and its bloodline in exchange for the political standing and military reach that Drenath provides." He paused. "And whatever else develops, at whatever pace it develops, without pressure or expectation." Rose looked at the river, the last light moving across the water in long gold ribbons. She thought about the woman she had been 12 days before the wedding, the woman who had arranged dying flowers and told herself the hollow feeling was nerves and pressed her thumb against a brooch, and performed smallness so consistently she had nearly forgotten it was a performance. She thought about her father, who had built a case he never lived to present, who had trusted the land and trusted her, who had loved her in the specific, serious way of someone who prepares their child for the world as it actually is, rather than the world they wish it were. She thought about the oak tree and the warmth that had moved through her palm, and the feeling of something 300 years old recognizing something in her. "Yes," she said. Not to everything, not to promises she couldn't yet see the full shape of, but to the alliance, to the standing, to the presence of someone who had walked beside her horse in the dark, and not once asked her to be grateful for it, to whatever else might develop, at whatever pace it developed. Kyle nodded once. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. In the weeks and months that followed, the Northern Territory came back to life with the specific, unhurried vitality of something that has been waiting in dormancy rather than dying. Families who had known the land before Oswin's manipulations began to return. The old stone structure became a proper hall, not grand but solid, smelling of wood smoke and pine resin and the particular mineral clarity of the river air. Rose learned, through the Drenath archives and through Rowan's careful research, and through something that seemed to come from the land itself in quiet, unasked-for moments, what it meant to be a groundkeeper, what the old covenant had required, and what it had offered, and what it might yet offer, in a world that had forgotten it existed. Oswin was stripped of every title and holding and sent into exile beyond the Pact territories, the harshest penalty the Council could impose short of death, and in many ways more complete. Cedric was held under Council restriction for 2 years, and stripped of his inheritance rights, the Ashvale lordship passing to a distant cousin who had no part in any of it. The Pack Elder Hadra sent Rose a formal letter of recognition 3 months after the council proceedings, acknowledging her as the rightful holder of the Northern Territory, and in a clause that Rowan said was extraordinarily unusual for a council document, noting the ancient standing of the Groundkeeper bloodline and its historical significance to the founding of the Territorial Covenant. Rose read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it with her father's documents, with the letter he had written to her, with the case he had built, with the crescent brooch she kept now not out of habit, but out of something more deliberate. Cale visited often, not always formally, not always with a retinue. Sometimes he arrived on horseback alone in the late afternoon and stayed to eat and talk, and left before morning. The alliance held because alliances built on genuine mutual respect tend to hold, and because both of them were people who kept their word in the specific, technical sense of saying exactly what they meant. There came a morning, deep into the following winter, when Rose stood at the ridge above the river in the early frost, and felt for the first time in her memory that she was standing precisely where she was supposed to be, not because someone had told her so, not because she had been placed there by someone else's plan or someone else's need, because she had arrived there herself. Behind her, the hall was warm with firelight. Below, the river ran clear over dark stones. The forest pressed close on every side, old and dense and full of the particular silence of things that have been here a very long time and intend to remain. She pressed her thumb against the crescent brooch one last time. Not for steadiness, not from fear, but in something like gratitude. And then she closed her hand around it and put it in her pocket and walked back down the ridge toward the warm light of the hall. She was the last of something, yes. She was also, entirely and at last, the first of herself. And that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.